Dudes, HW here. Good morning, good morning. It's a beautiful morning over in Nashville. That's where I am, staring out at the trees behind my house. And it's got some delicious coffee. Dudes, I was thinking about this the other day. Here's what I've learned from owning over 300 amplifiers. Whoa, dude. Big flex on us, huh? I don't own 300 today. I got a bunch, though. I got a bunch behind me, a bunch over there and stuff. I buy, sell, and trade amps all the time. Because I like to make profiles and captures of them and stuff. And if you don't know who I am, that's what I do. Videos like this always attract new people in who aren't in the modeling world, but primarily I do like modeling, content, Kemper, Quad Cortex, Tonex, all that stuff. And I've also been just buying, selling, and trading stuff for 20 years. I bought my first vintage amp. It was a 1968 drip edge Fender Bandmaster that someone had recovered in like PV style, really thick, hard Tolex. They had like restored it, not to vintage spec. Wish I still had that amp. One of the coolest amps in the world. Sold it years ago so that my girlfriend could pay her rent. Sad story, but happy story. She's my wife now. So at least it wasn't, some girl that ran off with a better guitar player. That happens. That can happen. So I've been told. No, she's a wonderful woman and the best part of my life. Her and my kids, But strangely, she's cheaper than my kids. She used to be the most expensive thing in my life. Then we had 3 kids, and they're even more money than her, But anyway, here's what I've learned owning over 300 amplifiers. I've owned everything. I'm one of those people who's like, okay, I tried it on a modeler or two, but I don't really know what it sounds like. I've listened to it on YouTube. I want to try it. So I have every Fender amp they made, like in the Blackface series. I've had tons of Tweed amps. I haven't had every Tweed amp, but I've had most of the Tweed amps. I've had a bunch of Marshalls over the years. I've had JCM 800s, 2203s, 2204s, which for a while was branded JCM 800. And prior to that was branded, Marshall MK2, Master Volume MK2. Same amp, different clothes. Then the JCM 800 kept the JCM 800 moniker and became a different amp, what it is kind of today. But the oldest ones are 2203s, 2204s. I've had I've had Silver Jubilees. Sold a Silver Jubilee to mostly fund my wife's wedding ring. Is there a theme here? Is there a theme? Wait a minute. And but that's okay. That's okay. Now she just wears a band and doesn't even wear the diamond. Oh man, that one hurts. No, I got another one right over there. I got a small. I got a 2553 Jubilee now, and an old 87 one. Anyway, I've had a bunch of stuff, and quit talking HW. What have you learned? What have you learned that's so great? What I've learned is that most of what you read on the internet is just... at worst, I would say it's lies. At best, I would say it's just a giant game of telephone. It's a lot of people repeating things and leaving out the details and the nuance until eventually what they're saying starts to mean nothing and then eventually becomes completely inaccurate. Let me give you one of those monikers right now. Oh, people will say any Fender clean sounds like a deluxe reverb. You guys, go download some of my free deluxe reverb stuff, link below in the description. I've done the deluxe reverb for free on every platform and stuff, or most of the platforms. Deluxes are mid-rangey, and they break up quickly, and they're rock and roll amps. They are old school classic rock and roll amps. They're blues rock amps. They're not clean amps. What people really mean is it sounds scooped in the mid-range like a Fender. And that's one of those weird things where it's like tastes like chicken, where chicken tastes like chicken and everything that tastes like chicken just kind of has a nondescript taste that you say is kind of like chicken. Mostly because it looks like chicken. I think that's a real thing too, right? So a lot of manufacturers describe things as like, oh, it sounds like the best deluxe you ever heard. I hear this with the AC30 as well. Sounds like an AC30, you know? My dudes, I was one of those guys who I thought the 90s AC30 or the Closet Classic Vox AC30 was the AC30 amps. I thought that was the AC30 sound. Then I played some Matchless stuff, heard about it, didn't really own it yet, but got to play a couple of those and Bad Cats. And then I eventually, when I moved to Nashville, I got my hands on... it was the first time I ever really had played a vintage AC30, and it was my buddy Stu G. And Stu G is a famous guitar player. He plays for Michael W. Smith, and he's played in a band called Delirious. And if you know, you know. Stu G's on so many popular worship records, a bunch of the live All Sons and Daughters stuff, just on so many things Stu's on. And Stu and I did a bunch of packs together for Kemper and Tonex and all that stuff. And Stu's an old school guy, English guy, into Marshalls and Voxes. And my gosh, he plugged in a Gretsch into his AC30 pre-top boost and played Day Tripper. And instantly I was like, I felt like the effect of mushrooms, you know what I mean, come over my body. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was psychedelic. Like John Kennedy was in office. You know, I had a poster of Marilyn Monroe on my wall, all that stuff. I wasn't even alive back then, but that's what it felt like. It just felt like that. I wanted to go protest the war. You know what I mean? It had that vibe. And it just, all of that feeling of the Beatles and everything was just there because my brain heard a sound that it had heard on records, but I hadn't heard anywhere else. It was so cut in the low end. So shallow in the low end, so bright, so cutting, so piercing. And it was just like, whoa, man. And all the amps that I had heard that had the Vox AC30 sound, they didn't have that sound. And so it was one of those things where it was like, yeah, I get it. Everything sounds like an AC30. Everything sounds like a deluxe. Actually, nothing sounds like an AC30. Some things do sound like a deluxe. Like the Tone King Imperial sounds like a deluxe if you put like firecrackers on the top of the high end, or if, you know what I mean? Or you took like some of the chime of the AC30 and put it into a deluxe. That actually, to me, reminds me of that. But that was kind of the first thing I learned from owning all those amps was people describing these things is not at all what they sound like. I learned that. Another like weird nomenclature thing that's out there that people talk about is this idea of a plexi. Now, what I've noticed is we refer to the plexi sound, we just mean early Marshall plexi, super lead or super bass, right? We really mean super lead. But if you think a plexi sounds like an AC/DC record, that's not what it sounds like. And then there's this other phenomenon that happens when you and I think of AC/DC records and we think of Led Zeppelin, we think of all that stuff, the gain we hear in our head is actually more like Def Leppard. We hear a lot more gain. If you go back and listen to any of those records, like stop this video now, open another window, go open up, Back in Black and stuff. It's remarkably clean for being a rock and roll record. You know what I mean? And then you listen to something like Tony Iommi and you listen to it today and it's like, this isn't even as much gain as a hard rock record, but they thought it was metal. But that's because they were coming from AC/DC, right? They were coming from Jimmy Page and stuff. And so a lot of that old classic rock stuff, it's clean amps turned way up. And that's really what a plexi is. So the difference between like a plexi and like a 70s Marshall is just some components inside, but really the 70s Marshalls got more brash and more everything, but they're still super leads. And so often they're still called plexis. But I own a couple actual late 60s pre-summer of 1969. So plexis are pre-summer of love. Basically halfway through 69 they changed. They really, really were extensions of that JTM 45 design. They were not very dirty, and they're not that aggressive sounding. They actually sound beautiful clean. I think some of the best cleans in the world are from Super Basses and my PA 100. I have a Marshall PA from 68 that's just, glorious clean tones and stuff. And you compare it to just like plexis later in the 70s, before we get to master volumes, before the circuit really changes. All we're changing is cap values and all this stuff, little things. We're not actually changing the model yet. And they're much brasher, much more gain, much harsher. Tubes play a big role in that and stuff. But that's one of those other things, is all these things that sound like plexis. What I found is very few things actually sound like vintage plexis. Vintage plexis are these wild animals of amps that are brash in the high end and deep in the low end and get very flubby and stuff. And so really, what has to happen with a vintage plexi, you turn that thing on 10, you got to mic it to really get the sweetness out of it, because it's throwing off all the goods and all the bads. You know what I'm saying? It's so loud and unruly and just broken. And those old amps, the term broken up, when you turn, they sound like things breaking inside. Like they don't sound polished and refined. And that's really a difference that I found with something like a Matchless. And the older stuff is, the newer stuff is much better amps. It really is. Now, we idolize the older stuff. And this is really what I learned, like, for example, with the Fender lineup. I've owned all the Fender lineup. And what I found is, look, the little ones, the very tiny ones, the champs and stuff are like novelties. They're good for practicing, but they're almost not useful. They sound too small. Princetons are cool. They're even better with a 12-inch speaker. Deluxes are really where we start cooking. But in my opinion, there's two camps in the Fender world. There really is almost like these two sounds that exist in the blackface world. Princetons, to me, sound like a smaller version of a Pro Reverb. And Deluxes are in its own thing. But then when you get to like the Twin Reverb, the Twin, the Dual Showman, kind of the Tremolux, and even like the Vibrolux, those all have a similar vein. Like they all have more scoop, a little less mid-range, kind of a lot more highs are capable. The Tremolux, the Bandmaster, those ones are all in a group. And then over on the other side, you got the Princeton, the Pro Reverb, the Bassman. These ones all seem to have more mids. They seem to be a little more rock focused when you break them up. They just have a little more balls. It might be the speaker accompaniments. Tremoluxes are a little on the weak side because they have those 210s, but those 210s also give it that sparkly sound. The Tremoluxes also share, like with the Vibrolux, those 210s, and you get that sparkly tone. And that brings me to another thing I've learned. Most of the sound is about the speaker. I've taken Deluxes from 65 and 68 where there's supposedly some changes that happen, and you put them through the same speaker, they're gosh darn identical. You take another amp, like you take a Super Reverb and a Bandmaster, or you take even a Bassman, and now you're going to hear very little difference, because the difference between that Bandmaster and the Super and the Bassman is really going to be the output transformer is much bigger. But you put those things into an oversized 212 Fender cab, you're going to get largely the same type of sound. And so when I've done these amps, I've tried to bring out the little differences that I hear, or the tendency that I hear, by miking it. And I think that's really the story. The speaker and the miking really is so much a part of the amplifier's sound. And when you own them all and you start plugging them in the same cab, you start to realize, oh, wow, it's like watching everything. It's like watching different movies through the same filter, or like buying a different lens for your camera. It's like this lens might work on, the camera guys are going to get upset at me. It might work on a Panasonic Lumix and a Sony. I don't think those have lenses that cross over actually. But my point is, the lens is really what's taking in the light and transferring it and doing all that stuff. And then after that, you've got processors, converters, those things, right? And so if you're just taking a picture, it's like the lens probably matters a lot more. than the actual DSLR behind it, I would imagine. I'm trying to come up with something like that. You know, it's the type of thing where you realize how similar everything is, but also how much the same things are. The other thing I've learned is it's all EQ. It really is all EQ. Old Tweeds are just poorly built blackface amps, right? That's kind of it, right? The designs got better. You hear the progression through from tweed to brownface to blackface and into silver. You hear them, you hear Leo changing the designs to make it cleaner, for longer, for louder, more fidelity, not less. And if anything, he's trying to get away from the crazy breakup that you get in a tweed, that like very, especially a tweed deluxe. Now later you get people who use that in a very musical sense, like the Eagles, Hotel California. Those guitars are tweed deluxes, they sound like that. And they're awesome. But, at the end of the day, what I realize is just things are more similar than they are different. You can get great tone out of pretty much anything. Not anything, but it doesn't have to be old and have like a lot of, vintage mojo to get you, a sound. You really can just take an amp. And there are later amps, like things like Two Rocks, Dumbles, that you see continue from a Fender lineage, but really do take on their own thing. Here's a sine wave continuum that is just really beautiful to me and sounds like this. So a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, sounds like a Fender, sounds like a deluxe. It doesn't. They don't sound like this, right? They sound very different. Deluxes, Fenders sound like, here's like a clean deluxe reverb, Lot less bass, lot less just kind of like anything, you know what I mean? And that's where the difference is, they're just all different. I mean, they're mostly the same, right? And that's what I mean, is like you put the same guitar and same cabinet and same everything. Those are different cabinets. If I put those two amps through the same cabinet, you'd get a much more similar sound. And with that little short clip, you can make them sound very much alike. But players are going to notice they feel very different to me. The bass is very different. I feel like I'm playing a big amp when I play that. When I play small amp with a lot less bass, I feel like I'm playing a small amp because you just don't get as much. Here's the normal channel, on a deluxe clean. That's a beautiful sound too. That is a very beautiful sound. But something like this is also a beautiful sound. Or this. And so those differences, they come at such a huge cost, But I'll tell you, I've had some of the best tone of my life on a Kemper. That's just the truth, right? Because I was able to dial that thing in and get all the delays, and then save it and never change it and show up gig after gig after gig with the exact same sound. You want to know when else I had some of the best tone of my life? When all I did was carry around a little pedal board and I had a reissue Princeton reverb. And that thing just, man, you could turn that thing up to 5 or 6 and it just cooked live. Throw a mic on it and it just gave up the goods, gave up the tone. I could put it where I want it, aim it up at me. Sound guys never said, that's too loud. But as long as and actually that worked in my favor. A lot of people go, oh, Princeton's don't keep up with the drummer. That's kind of what I was after. I would just point that thing up at me a little bit so I could hear it just enough. And then I was happy. Sound guy was happy because it wasn't so loud that it bled everywhere. And it gave up the goods at 5 or 6. It really would get cooking. Another time I had some of the best tone in my life. I dragged vintage Marshalls and vintage Marshalls to a church. And they looked at me like I was insane. And I was. That was a dumb, crazy thing to do. But somehow I made that all fit in my 1998 black Toyota Corolla. And I showed up. And one guy looked at me and was like, that is ridiculous. And I was like, but it's going to sound great. It's going to sound ridiculous. And then another time I had the best tone of my life. I had a Vox Hayseed 30. And I played that for a long time. And I went, this is tremendous. And Hayseed 30. It was a, what's that brand called? Valvetech Hayseed 30. And it was beautiful. Great. Great amps. I'd love to get one of those Hayseed 30s again. I had it in red, and it was a great amp. Had mismatched speakers, blue, and an H30. It was killer. And then a couple times I had a sound guy come to me. 2 different sound guys came to me and said, that amp is one of the best sounding amps I've ever heard live. And you know what it was? It was a Bandmaster Reverb TFL 5005D that someone had crammed into a cabinet that was looked like it was made in someone's house. In their garage. It was not the right dimensions for a Fender cab. I wish I hadn't sold that. What did I do with that? For a while, I just left it at my church. It became the church amp. Damn, I wish I still had that. I wish I had that. Next time I'll do a video maybe on gear I wish hadn't gotten away, but that's okay. Now honestly, dudes, I play Kemper and Tonex more than anything. I got a Kemper cab and a Tonex right here. And at volumes that are just way more comfortable, I can have my Deluxe on 5 without having it so loud. Oh, it doesn't sound the exact same, HW. Yeah, but I'm not going deaf either. You know what I mean? And I enjoy doing this and having kind of the tone there with the pedals at my feet and just sort of being at a reasonable volume where I'm not hurting my ears and it's just very enjoyable to listen to, rather than pulling out the Deluxe and trying to turn it to 5, but then settling and turning it to 3 and then trying to use a pedal to get the sound of the, you know what I mean? It's like, hey, this is cool. I'm happy. I can focus on the guitar playing, She's about having fun, y'all.